October 1944, on the island of Leyte in the Philippines, American soldiers expected to find abandoned Japanese barracks. Instead, they stumbled upon something far more disturbing: a hidden system of captivity that had broken thousands of women across Asia. What they discovered inside those compounds was so shocking that even battle-hardened veterans were left speechless. This was not just war. It was organized cruelty on a scale the world had never imagined. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why the liberation of these women was both horrifying and unforgettable. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe for more World War II histories that reveal the darkest truths buried by time. The comfort station system began quietly in 1932, far from the front lines of global war. The Japanese military claimed it was a necessary measure, a way to control troops and prevent random violence against civilians. But behind that justification was something far darker: the creation of a vast network of sexual slavery that stretched from Manchuria to the Pacific Islands. Over the next decade, tens of thousands of women would vanish into this system, deceived or abducted, and never seen by their families again. Recruitment often came in the form of lies. Young women in Korea, China, the Philippines, and beyond were promised factory jobs, nursing work, or opportunities in cities. Others were simply dragged from villages during raids. Once captured, they were transported under military guard, shipped to remote garrisons and frontline posts where escape was impossible. At every stage of the journey, their identities were erased. Names were replaced with numbers. Their languages were forbidden. They were moved across thousands of miles so that even if they tried to flee, they would be trapped in foreign lands where no one could help them. The architecture of control was deliberate. Comfort stations were built within or near military compounds, fenced off, guarded heavily, and hidden from public view. They were designed to sever every connection to the outside world. Even civilians nearby often had no idea what went on inside the bamboo walls and shuttered barracks. Survivors later recalled that the isolation was complete. Letters never reached home, messages never left, and the sound of approaching boots only ever meant suffering was coming. By the time the Pacific War reached its height, the system had become an institution, accepted within the military as routine. To the outside world, it remained invisible, carefully hidden by layers of secrecy and denial. Yet inside, thousands of women lived under conditions designed not only to control their bodies, but to shatter their spirits. For them, survival itself became an act of resistance, and hope was something that could only be whispered in the dark. For the women forced into comfort stations, daily existence became a nightmare without end. The conditions were carefully designed to strip away individuality, choice, and even the will to hope. Captors made it clear from the beginning: escape was impossible, resistance was useless, and no one from the outside world would ever come. The women were told repeatedly that they had been forgotten, that their families would never search for them, and that death was the only release waiting at the end of captivity. The psychological control was as calculated as the physical abuse. Guards drilled fear into them by turning ordinary routines into rituals of humiliation. They were ordered when to eat, when to sleep, and how to behave. Even the smallest act of disobedience brought swift punishment: beatings, confinement, or worse. Over time, this conditioning reshaped their minds. Survivors later said they came to believe that all soldiers, regardless of nationality, were threats, and that survival depended on absolute submission. Hunger and illness weakened bodies already battered by abuse. Medical care was almost non-existent. Malnutrition hollowed their faces. Infections spread untreated, and diseases were ignored until they became permanent scars. Some women wasted away to less than 80 pounds, their bones pressing against skin. Yet even as their health collapsed, the system forced them to continue, grinding them down until they no longer recognized themselves. Perhaps most devastating was the destruction of identity. Forbidden to use their own languages, denied cultural practices, and cut off from family, many survivors later described feeling as though their very selves had been erased. They were alive, but stripped of everything that once gave life meaning. In this environment of total control, the goal was not just to hold prisoners, it was to break them so completely that they would no longer imagine freedom. 3 years in such conditions felt like an eternity. Each day blended into the next, marked only by the sound of boots in the yard or the clang of a lock at night. For many, time itself stopped, leaving only darkness, fear, and the fragile hope that somehow, against all odds, survival was still possible. By late 1944, the tide of the war had shifted. American forces swept through the Philippines, island by island, dismantling Japanese strongholds. Soldiers advancing through Leyte expected the usual sights of war: abandoned outposts, supply caches, or the bodies of retreating troops. What they did not expect were the hidden remnants of a system they had only heard whispers about in intelligence briefings. Reports had mentioned the possibility of women being held in Japanese compounds, but no one fully grasped the scale or the brutality until they saw it with their own eyes. When the 32nd Infantry Regiment secured one such compound in October, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes noted that the buildings were eerily quiet. Soldiers moved cautiously, scanning for snipers or traps. Then came the shock. From the shadows of back rooms and bamboo walls emerged women, frail, terrified, unable to stand. They did not cry for help. They did not run toward their supposed rescuers. Instead, they shrank back, convinced that another form of punishment was about to begin. Hayes later reported his disbelief. "We found dozens of young women, clearly not Filipino. They were terrified of us, wouldn't come out until our medics offered food. It took hours to convince them we weren't going to hurt them." Hardened soldiers, men who had fought through jungle ambushes and bloody assaults, admitted they were unprepared for this. The women's fear was so absolute that liberation itself looked like another trap. This first encounter revealed the depth of psychological conditioning. These women had been told for years that no one would rescue them, that if foreign soldiers ever arrived, they would only bring more violence. To see American uniforms after years of khaki-clad captors was not reassurance. It was confusion, dread, and disbelief. For the soldiers, the discovery reframed the war. They were not just fighting to capture ground or defeat armies. They were uncovering a hidden atrocity, a secret crime buried inside military compounds. And for the women, liberation was not yet freedom. It was a terrifying question. Could these new men be trusted? Or was this only another chapter of cruelty? When American soldiers finally entered the bamboo-walled compounds, they did not meet grateful cries of liberation. They found silence, broken only by the shuffle of bare feet and the soft sobs of women too frightened to lift their heads. Survivors had been conditioned to believe that any man in uniform was a predator, that rescue was an illusion, and that survival depended on submission. The moment of first contact became one of the most difficult encounters these soldiers ever faced. Not a clash of weapons, but of trust. Private Daniel Martinez, one of the first men inside, recalled the scene decades later. "They wouldn't look at us. They dropped to their knees, heads down, waiting for orders. When I tried to help one woman stand, She flinched like I was about to strike her. It broke my heart to the soldiers. Their uniforms symbolized liberation. To the women, they represented only another wave of danger. Every gesture, every word risked triggering memories of pain. Medics quickly realized brute reassurance was useless. They put down their rifles, approached slowly, and offered food with open hands. Even then, the women hesitated, some refusing to touch anything until female personnel arrived. Language barriers made matters worse. Most survivors spoke Korean, Chinese, or dialects of the Philippines. With no common words, the soldiers resorted to tone and body language. They lowered their voices, smiled, gestured gently, but still progress was painfully slow. Hours passed before the first women stepped forward. The moment was small, a bite of bread, a sip of water, but it marked the beginning of a fragile shift. The soldiers began to understand that victory on the battlefield was different from victory here. To save these women, they would have to dismantle years of fear, piece by piece. The first contact was not a celebration. It was a revelation. It showed the Americans that the war had produced horrors they had never imagined, and it showed the women that perhaps, just perhaps, there was life beyond captivity. But belief in that possibility would take time, and patience few soldiers had ever been asked to show. When Army doctors and nurses first examined the liberated women, they quickly realized they were facing conditions that went far beyond ordinary wartime injuries. Malnutrition was universal. Some women weighed less than 80 pounds. Their skin stretched tightly over bones. Their muscles wasted to nothing. Many could not even stand without assistance. Their bodies bore untreated wounds, cuts that had festered into infections, bruises that never healed, burns left raw from years of neglect. Almost every survivor suffered from untreated sexually transmitted diseases, the result of repeated abuse under conditions where medical care was non-existent. Captain Helen Morrison, an Army nurse stationed at the evacuation hospital in Tacloban, admitted in her notes that nothing in her training had prepared her for what she encountered. They would not undress for examination. They would not eat the food we gave them. They would not lie down on cots, choosing instead to crouch in corners. Everything we did reminded them of authority, and authority meant pain. Morrison and her team quickly realized that the standard medical routines, removing clothing, using surgical instruments, even raising one's voice, could trigger panic and resistance. To treat these women, protocols had to be rewritten on the spot. Whenever possible, female personnel conducted examinations, and interpreters explained every step. Nurses allowed survivors to wash themselves in privacy before treatment, understanding that the act of bathing alone was itself a restoration of dignity. Food was given in small, careful portions to avoid overwhelming digestive systems ruined by starvation. The psychological damage was just as overwhelming as the physical. Many women recoiled from touch, interpreting even a gentle hand on the arm as the beginning of violence. Others refused to sleep indoors, choosing instead to remain outside under open skies, where they felt less trapped. The medical staff had to relearn patience, offering trust slowly, proving through action that care did not equal cruelty. For the doctors and nurses, the shock was profound. They had trained to save soldiers torn by bullets and shrapnel, but here the wounds were deeper, etched into bodies and minds by years of systemic abuse. Every bandage, every meal, every soft word became part of a struggle not just to heal, but to restore humanity that had been systematically stripped away. Even after the first medical care began, one barrier loomed larger than all others: language. The liberated women spoke Korean, Chinese, or local Filipino dialects. Few Americans understood a single word. Without communication, every act of kindness risked being mistaken for cruelty, every medical gesture for another violation. The silence between survivor and liberator was heavy, filled with mistrust, born from years of trauma. Desperate to bridge this gap, the Army brought in interpreters. Among them was Sergeant Grace Kimura, a Japanese-American serving with the Military Intelligence Service. Her presence startled the women. At first, seeing a Japanese face among American troops triggered terror. Many believed it was a trick, another form of deception. But when Kimura spoke to them in Korean, explaining in halting words that she was American, born in Hawaii, the fear began to falter. For the first time, someone could put their suffering into words that others could understand. Communication opened doors that medicine alone could not. Women who had stayed silent for days began whispering fragments of their stories. Some asked if their families were alive. Others wanted to know if the war was ending. Many simply cried as they heard their own language spoken without threats attached. Nurses learned quickly that tone and patience mattered as much as translation. A soft voice, a respectful distance, a willingness to wait. All of these became vital tools in rebuilding trust. The process also revealed how captivity had eroded cultural identity. Some survivors had been taken so young and held so long that their native tongues had faded. They spoke Japanese under duress, forgetting the songs, prayers, and words of their childhoods. Liberation, then, was not only about physical rescue. It was about reconnecting them with pieces of themselves that captivity had tried to erase. Each word translated, each question answered, each gesture explained, became a thread stitching humanity back together. Communication did not solve everything. It could not erase years of cruelty, but it planted the seed of recognition. For the women, it was proof that they were not invisible. For the soldiers, it was a reminder that liberation meant more than victory. It meant listening, and listening was the first step toward healing. Liberation was not a single moment. It was a process, fragile and uneven, built from the smallest of gestures. For women conditioned to expect cruelty at every turn, kindness itself felt alien. Yet in the days that followed, acts so ordinary they might have gone unnoticed in peacetime became revolutionary to those who had lived under total control. One survivor later described the moment she was given a bar of soap and a basin of clean water. An American nurse set it down, then quietly walked away, leaving her to wash in privacy. For 3 years, every part of her existence had been watched, ordered, and violated. To be left alone, to be trusted with something as simple as washing her own body, felt like proof that her life had changed. Another woman recalled the shock of being allowed to choose her food, even if it was only rice or bread. That choice, however small, restored a piece of dignity captivity had stolen. The soldiers and nurses began to realize that freedom was measured not only in safety, but in autonomy. They encouraged survivors to make decisions for themselves. When to rest, what clothing to wear, whether to join others or stay apart. Slowly, the women began to stand taller, their movements less guarded, their eyes no longer fixed on the ground. Yet recovery was uneven. Some clung to submission, unsure if the new order would last. Others tested their freedom cautiously, as if waiting for punishment to follow. But every time a gesture of kindness met no cruelty in return, the wall of fear cracked a little more. Privacy, choice, and respect, things so simple to outsiders, were powerful reminders that they were human beings, not property. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it complete. But as survivors bathed alone, ate without commands, and slept without guards, they began to reclaim pieces of their humanity. Each act of dignity restored was a victory, not just against the war, but against the system that had sought to erase them. As survivors slowly emerged from fear, what stunned their liberators was not just the depth of their suffering, but the resilience that had carried them through it. These women had lived in conditions designed to destroy the human spirit. Yet within those bamboo walls and guarded compounds, they had built fragile lifelines of hope. Older women often took responsibility for protecting the younger ones, shielding them from violence when possible, sharing what little food they had, or whispering encouragement in the darkest hours. They created secret routines, teaching songs, weaving baskets, telling stories, to remind each other that life still existed beyond captivity. Small acts of resistance, invisible to guards, became powerful acts of survival. Chong Sun-mi, a Korean survivor later liberated on Okinawa, recalled how a Chinese woman named Li Mei-ling shared her rice when illness left her unable to stand. A Filipina girl, Rosa, taught others to weave straw baskets, giving their hands something to do, their minds something to focus on beyond despair. "We became sisters in suffering," Sun-mi later testified. "Without each other, we would have died, not from hunger alone, but from losing the will to live." For the American soldiers and nurses, hearing these stories changed their understanding of the women before them. They were not passive victims. They were survivors who had endured unimaginable cruelty, yet had kept each other alive through courage and compassion. In their sisterhood, liberators saw a strength that defied the system built to break them. Decades later, when some survivors chose to speak publicly, they carried these stories of mutual care into their testimony. They did not only speak of abuse, they spoke of solidarity, of how friendship and shared humanity allowed them to endure when survival seemed impossible. Their testimony transformed horror into a warning, but also into a testament of resilience. The comfort station system had been designed to erase dignity. What remained, however, was proof that dignity could never be fully destroyed. In the bonds they built and the courage they carried, these women showed that survival itself was an act of defiance. When the war ended, liberation was only the beginning of another struggle. Many survivors faced the painful question of where to go. Some had no homes to return to. Families killed, villages destroyed, communities scattered. Others feared the crushing stigma awaiting them in traditional societies, where sexual violence, though forced, carried shame that silenced victims. Some chose to remain in the Philippines or other liberated territories, building new lives rather than returning to places where they expected rejection. For many, freedom came with loneliness. Repatriation efforts revealed the depth of trauma. Relief agencies and the U.S. military provided clothing, food, and medical treatment, but they could not erase scars carried in body and mind. Survivors often lived with nightmares, chronic illness, and the memory of years spent under total control. Some never spoke publicly, preferring silence to the risk of judgment. Others, in time, became voices of truth. By the 1990s, Korean, Chinese, and Filipina survivors began to testify before governments and international courts, demanding recognition. Their words shook the world. These were not isolated crimes, but a vast system of organized sexual slavery. The discovery of comfort stations by American troops in 1944 and 1945 created the first documented record of these atrocities. Reports, medical files, and soldiers' testimonies ensured the crimes could not be denied. They helped shape post-war trials and contributed to the evolution of international law, establishing sexual violence as a war crime, not merely a byproduct of conflict. But perhaps the greatest legacy lay in the women themselves. Their survival was resistance. Their ability to rebuild families, raise children, and reclaim dignity was victory over a system designed to reduce them to nothing. In their testimonies, they left a warning that when war dehumanizes, the cruelty inflicted can echo for generations. Even today, standing at memorials or reading their accounts, the shock of liberation endures. What American soldiers found in those compounds was horrifying, but what the women carried out of them was stronger still: the unbreakable truth of survival against a system built on destruction.